Welcome. In this presentation, we shall look at how coastal upwelling affects the generation of potential fishing zones along the east coast of India in the southwestern Bay of Bengal. Coastal upwelling is a process which involves a surface wind-driven upward movement of waters, and this is one of the primary determinants of productivity, particularly along the coasts. Now, this is driven by surface winds which blow parallel to the coast, with the coast on its left-hand side and the open ocean to its right. In addition to the aforementioned local mode of coastal upwelling, it can also be driven by remote forcing, which consists of wind-generated disturbances which are produced at a location far from the coast where the coastal upwelling occurs, but these propagate along both the equator and along coastal boundaries and modulate the nutricline depth in a way similar to the locally driven process of coastal upwelling, such that nutrient-rich waters are introduced into the surface layer, which in turn drives productivity. In this slide, on the left-hand side, we can see the propagation of coastal Kelvin waves. So these waves can propagate typically along any lateral boundary. So it can propagate along the equator, which virtually acts as a lateral boundary, or along coastlines. And on the right hand side, we can see how these internal Kelvin waves modulate the depth of the thermocline and thereby introduce nutrients into the surface layer. Now let us look at the concept of potential fishing zones. Potential fishing zones are identified areas of fish aggregation within the ocean. In a study by Tumala et al. Of 2008, a series of 18 controlled experiments consisting of fishing operations inside these identified zones and outside of it, a comparison between the two has illustrated that there is a remarkable increase in the probability of success within potential fishing zones. Now, success here is considered as the recovery of the cost of fishing along with an additional 10%. Potential fishing zone advisory is given out on an operational basis by Indian agency called INCOIS, and as we can see in this plot, the user base for these products has been increasing steadily over the years. The goal of the present poster is to analyze the relation between coastal upwelling and these potential fishing zones. And in order to do that, we first characterize the occurrence of potential fishing zones within the coastal upwelling period, and then we try to relate the drivers of coastal upwelling with the generation of potential fishing zones. To quantify coastal upwelling, we have first used the alongshore wind stress, which is simply the component of wind stress parallel to the coast. And from it, we calculate the offshore Aikman transport, which is the offshore transport of waters driven by this coast parallel component of winds. In addition to that, the response, the coastal upwelling response in terms of sea surface temperatures is quantified in terms of the coastal contrast of temperatures. So that is taken as the coastal SST minus the offshore SST. In addition to these two, which constitute the driver and the response, we also analyze the sea surface height anomalies along the coast. Typically, for a coastal upwelling system, we expect these sea surface height anomalies to turn negative during the period of coastal upwelling. And in order to analyze this and also to separate this kind of variability from the propagation of Kelvin waves, we have used a complex EOF analysis. The complex EOF analysis is a slight modification of the original EOF analysis to allow it to detect lagged excitations instead of simultaneous excitations, which are detected in a classical EOF analysis. And the data sets we have used consist of multi-satellite reanalysis products distributed by Copernicus Marine Services, and we have used the wind stress components, sea surface temperature, and sea surface height anomaly. for the characterization and identification of potential fishing zones, since our region is poor in chlorophyll data due to the cloud cover present during monsoon, which happens to be both the peak fishing season and the peak coastal upwelling season, we primarily rely on persistent thermal fronts. And these fronts are identified following algorithms similar to what is followed by incoys for the generation of their potential fishing zone product, and it consists of the Kayula-Cornilon single image edge detection algorithm. Uh, at the basic level, this algorithm starts from a histogram analysis, which is carried out over a shifting window, and histogram analysis checks whether the temperature distributions within each window are roughly bimodal. That is, whether both hot and cold waters are present within each window. And subsequently, a cohesion test is carried out, and finally, the edge is detected based on some gradient criteria. Now, the difference between this and defining just high gradient regions as fronts is demonstrated in this panel. So what we see here is that if there is some cold water on the left side and there is a cold water filament which extends into the warm water region, let's say, a window such as this is not going to generate a bimodal histogram. So a filament such as this will not be identified as a front using this algorithm. Instead, a front will only be identified when it acts as a boundary between a cold and a hot water mass. Once these fronts are identified, we characterize them in terms of the frontal probability index, which has been used by Belkin et al. 2009. And this is a parameter which is calculated at each pixel location as the number of occurrences of a front at that location divided by the total number of observations there. Further, the frontal occurrence within an area can also be calculated using a similar approach, which is to add the number of frontal pixels occurring within a region. And this parameter we call F1. To discuss our results, we first look at the coastal upwelling system itself. And in this plot, the dark color or the shading in the background, the black and white, represents our alongshore wind stress driven Ekman transport or the offshore Ekman transport. So in a way, this can be considered the driving force for coastal upwelling, which is driven locally. The blue, red, and white contours on top of this shading represent the coastal sea surface temperature contrast. So this can be construed of as the response or the thermal response to the local wind stress, or the local upwelling generating forcing. Now, our observation in this region shows us that there are two distinct parts of this coastal upwelling system. In the northern part of the system, which stretches roughly up to 0.7 or 8, which is north of the Krishna Godavari Delta region, we observe that the blue contours, the darkest blue contours, in fact appear in a period which is slightly earlier than the period of light background color, the white and light gray background color. Whereas in the southern portion, which consists of points 14 to 23, that is south of the Krishna Godavari Delta, what we observe is that the background light shading, that is the driver of coastal upwelling or the longshore winds, and the surface and the thermal coastal upwelling response, that is the SST contrast, actually agree quite well. So the blue contours appear at the point of time when sufficient alongshore winds are available. Now this southern case is what we would actually expect from a locally driven coastal upwelling system, whereas the northern case looks somewhat anomalous in the sense that the response seems to be preceding the driving force. To further explore this, we analyzed the sea surface height anomalies, and what we observed is that there is a patch of negative sea surface heights indicated here by the dashed green lines, which appear just prior to the initiation of the blue contours, or just prior to the initiation of the surface thermal response. And there is also a dashed yellow contour representative of positive sea surface height anomalies, which appears around the time when it ceases. Subsequently, our CEOF analysis, the complex EOF analysis, further illustrates this point, where we are able to separate two distinct modes of sea surface height variability. So these modes consist of a magnitude and a phase. So in this case, the change of phase represents a temporal shift. So the slight rotation in the arrows in the clockwise direction from this part to this part illustrates that this excitations are temporally occur slightly later than these excitations. And in this way, we are able to separate out two modes, of which the first one appears to be roughly similar to the pattern that is expected of the coastally trapped Kelvin wave, which is driven close to Somalia and travels along the equator, is blocked by the Java-Sumatra group of islands, and then enters into the Bay of Bengal basin. So we observe high levels of excitation close to Java-Sumatra, which slowly decrease and extend down to the Krishna Godavari delta. And in the second mode, we observe excitations which are roughly uniform, but they primarily occur along the southern part of the coast, including the Krishna Godavari delta and the portion south of it primarily. And also, as we analyze the temporal signatures of these modes, what we see is that the positive and negative peaks of the first mode, which we are associating with the coastally trapped Kelvin waves, also closely matches its climatological signature. Similarly, the response of the local wind-driven coastal upwelling mode matches the variability of local winds. This leads us to conclude that the northern part of the Bay of Bengal, east coast of India, the southwestern Bay of Bengal coastal upwelling system, is in fact a remotely driven coastal upwelling system, whereas the southern part of it is a locally driven one. Should also be mentioned here that we have found that these modes are closely related to the equatorial wind forcing and the local wind forcing, alongshore winds, respectively. To further analyze the coastal upwelling in the system, we have looked at the climatological profiles of temperature uh, along the strongest coastal upwelling points along the northern and southern part of the coast, and we observed that the upward curving of isotherms is present to some extent in both of these places, although it is much stronger in the south than in the north. Subsequently, we characterize the potential fishing zone activity in terms of thermal fronts. And our first observation here is that persistent fronts primarily occur only for the southern part of the system and not for the northern part of the system. Thus, it is only the locally driven stronger coastal upwelling system which shows these signatures, while the northern remotely driven system does not show these signatures. An analysis of the thermal gradients over the region of persistent frontal activity illustrates a shift of the high gradient region from the north to the south, a slight shift from pre-monsoon to monsoon, and the direction of these fronts indicate that they mostly point in the offshore direction, as we would expect for a coastal upwelling case, with cold waters along the coast and warm waters away from it. This image illustrates a typical weekly composite for a single year, in this case 2014, that we would expect with the thermal fronts. The red fronts here are associated with higher or stronger thermal gradients, while the green fronts are associated with weaker gradients. And although it's very difficult to draw very meaningful conclusions from it, what we can see is that during the monsoon period, there are often strong fronts stretching all along this coast intermittently, appearing both during July, slightly earlier during April, and then again during August. So subsequently, we carry out a comparison between the driver of coastal upwelling, which is my offshore Ekman transport driven by local alongshore winds, and my my F1, which is the number of frontal pixels which occur within a particular area. Now, this is carried out only for the southern part of the coast where the persistent frontal activity was observed. And what we see here is that, firstly, the coherence between these signals primarily occur over seasonal timescales. That is to say, the first three harmonics, so between 1 to 3 cycles per year. And after filtering both of these signals down to the seasonal frequencies, we can observe that the period of positive offshore Ekman transport typically contains a peak of frontal activity or a peak of F1 within its earlier part. So this is observed for here for 2007, 18, 17, 13, 11, and 10. In addition to this, there is sometimes a winter F1 maximum, but this is not related to coastal upwelling. This is a period of strong coastal currents which bring river water down along the coast. Therefore, to summarize, what we observe here is that the two coastal upwelling systems to the north and to the south of the Krishna Godavari Delta are different in terms of their driving mechanisms, but they're also fundamentally different in terms of their surface thermal response, in the sense that persistent thermal fronts are only generated for the southern locally driven system and not for the northern remotely driven one. Secondly, we observe that the coherence between local upwelling favorable winds and the frontal activity primarily occurs over seasonal timescales, which is partly also because the winds in this region happen to be quite seasonal in nature. And finally, we see that the seasonal maxima of Ekman transport typically contains a high frontal activity or a peak of frontal activity during its earlier half. These findings have several important implications in terms of the identification and prediction of potential fishing zones. So firstly, because this is a very data sparse region, particularly during monsoon, when cloud cover prevents the acquisition of visible and infrared data, if it is possible to associate the potential fishing zone activity with ocean winds or with any of these modes of sea surface height anomaly variation, it might be possible to introduce a source of microwave data which is capable of informing us about, which is capable of detecting these potential fishing zones. And this would alleviate the data constraints in the region to some extent. And the second more important implication of this is in terms of understanding what effect coastal upwelling has on commercial fishing operations. So for example, it is quite well known how coastal upwelling systems are evolving under climate change. But an analysis such as this can allow us to identify what precise effect such a shift will have on commercial fishing. Particularly, it will help us anticipate the concentration of fishing or how much area of aggregation of fishing is being generated, and long-term shifts in the occurrence of these can have potentially significant implications for fishing in the region, which is a source of livelihood for many people. These are our references. Reference 5 includes our analysis of the coastal upwelling system, which we have described here. And I'm sorry, reference 6 And reference 6 includes a method of estimating Ekman transport uh, within a automated software package that we have worked on.